the Status of Women 69. I'm Patricia Cumby, the Communications Manager for Global Rights for Women. And we are pleased that you are here today for the Coordinated Institutional Reform for Gender-Based Violence and Trafficking of Survivors. And before we get started, I would like to share a land acknowledgement. Global Rights for Women gratefully acknowledges the Indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it is important for us to recognize that we have benefited and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and acknowledges we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. We recognize the discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous people around the world. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women. Please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can help dismantle continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. Since people are joining us from around the world, at this time, if you'd like to put into the chat the land that you're acknowledging, we'd appreciate it. Thank you again so much for being here today for the Coordinated Institutional Reform for Gender-Based Violence and Trafficking Survivors. I would like to take a moment to introduce our guests and share a little bit about them before we get started. I'd like to start first with Maro Matosian, who is an activist and feminist dedicated to the advancement of women's rights in Armenia. In 2010, Maro founded the Women's Support Center in Yerevan to assist and empower women and children victims of domestic violence, as well as advocate for institutional protection of victims of domestic abuse. The center started with the help of AIWA, Tufenkian Foundation, and USAID, and is now considered a premier center offering comprehensive assistance with social workers, psychologists, lawyers, as well as 2 shelters. The center is run based on international standards and methodology for victims of domestic violence. Maro underwent training in the United States and is one of the founding members of the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women, and is also the founder of the Coalition of the Domestic Support Centers. Maro has also authored a number of publications and guidelines and has many leadership positions around the world, including in Europe, and we are so grateful to you for your participation in this event today. Welcome, Maro Matosian. And I would like to also introduce Cheryl Thomas, the Executive Director for Global Rights for Women. Since 1993, Cheryl has worked with partners around the world to promote women's human rights. She's provided consultation and training on best practices and legal reform on violence against women to government officials and civil society groups in dozens of countries. In 2008, she was selected by the United Nations to be one of 15 experts from around the world to create the United Nations model legislation on violence against women. In March 2011, she was recognized by Newsweek magazine as one of 150 women who shaped the world. And in previous positions, Cheryl was the director of the women's program at the Advocates for Human Rights, the director of the court monitoring program at Watch, and an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota Law School, and a partner in the law firms Briggs and Morgan. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for facilitating this conversation today. And lastly, I would like to share that Jean Enrique, who is the other panelist today, is shuttling between meetings, so she will be arriving for this event soon. In the meanwhile, I will also share her bio with you. Jean Enrique is currently the Executive Director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Asia Pacific. She was awarded as one of the outstanding women in the nation's service in 2010 and as one of the 7 modern heroes of 2011 by Yahoo Philippines. She is accredited as Gender and Development Resource Person of the Philippine Commission on Women. She also chairs the Champion Women's Advisory Group of the Interagency Standing Committee, the longest standing and highest level humanitarian coordination forum created by the UN General Assembly on protection from sexual exploitation and abuse since 2024. She's also a person who has extensive international and national expertise and does training on trafficking, prostitution, and other forms of violence against women, gender issues, women's political participation, and development for the last 38 years. She's been invited to speak on women's issues in 38 countries. And we are also very, very honored to have Jean Enriquez join us shortly today. I would also like to let you know that we will be sharing more information about our panelists today in the chat, and we also welcome your questions in the chat today. We'll be taking time at the end to include you in the discussion. So now I would like to turn it over to Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Pat. And I'm just delighted to see all of you here from so many places around the world. We're honored to have you with us. I want to take a minute to thank our wonderful Olivia Reed, who is going to be managing some of the technological issues here, and thank Mauro again. Mauro and I have worked together for so many years, and I'm just delighted to have you with us, Mauro. And Jean will get here just as soon as she can. We're all here in New York at obviously the Commission on the Status of Women, and it's a busy, busy time. So she is going to join us in just a little bit. So we'll welcome her when she's able to join us. And yeah, let's get started with the presentation. My PowerPoint begins with our just a statement about our mission here at Global Rights for Women. We are focused on systemic and legal change, laser focused on systemic and legal change on violence against women. You'll see on our website, if you go to that, the exact language is that we work with leaders around the world, like Mauro and Jean, to advance women and girls' human right to live free from violence through legal and systemic change. So that's really very much what this event is about today, is how that is done. We can go to the next slide here. Actually, a couple of slides forward would be wonderful. We've got the introductions, there's the mission, wonderful. And our goals for the event today are to introduce, now our time is limited, of course, and we could talk about this for many hours, but we will do an introduction really today on how legal and institutional systemic change can be achieved through a coordinated community response. And both Mauro and Jean and our team at Global Rights for Women are really experienced in these techniques. So we invited Mauro and Jean to talk about how exactly it is that they do that in their countries and their organizations. Just a reminder, please do put your questions in the chat. We may not be able to answer them all today, but we'll also give you our contact information, and we can be following up with you too after this event. So we can go to the next slide there. The reason really that we focus so intently on systemic and legal change on violence against women are these statistics here that you see. We increasingly now today are suffering a pandemic of violence against women and girls around the world. Luckily, we have more statistics now that leaders around the world at the United Nations, at the World Bank, all throughout the institutions that do global work. There's a recognition that this is a profound burden, not only on women and girls and their families, but on nations. We know that when there are effective laws and those laws are implemented to address violence against women, they not only, of course, affect women and girls' lives, but they also affect the productivity of communities around the world. So that is the reason for our laser focus on systemic and legal change on violence against women at Global Rights for Women. We know that we just can't build enough shelters for individual victims of violence. It's not possible in the world to do that with these kinds of rates. We know that we can't throw all the men who use violence in jails. So that we need to be addressing the root causes and what our governments can be doing, our institutions, our civil society organizations in partnerships with governments to intervene in this violence. Okay, we can go to the next slide there. And I just want to introduce this idea of systemic change with some concrete points here. It's really interesting and important to identify individual issues with workers in our systems, whether it's police, prosecutors, judges, civil society organizations, with systemic issues. Individual issues, in a nutshell, you can just kind of think of them as let's just use the example of a police officer who, as we say here, lacks skills or training or may not be following a policy that he or she is directed to follow, using the accepted practice of the agency. So then you need to focus on that individual, the accountability for that individual to be using those directives that they're required to do. Systemic issues tell you about, are focused on the way an agency organizes itself through directives, policies. Maybe there's a law that's missing or language of a law that's missing. So those systemic issues are what we're focused on when we're doing systemic change efforts. I want to just take a note here. We had a question about this when we did our presentation live here in New York on Monday. Not to be confused with systemic advocacy versus individual advocacy. Now, they all overlap, of course, they're integrated, but when you're doing systemic advocacy, you're targeting those rewriting possibly the laws, making sure there's more training for folks that don't have it. When you're doing individual advocacy on behalf of victims, you're standing beside victims, whether they're an individual victim, whether she's seeking shelter or legal services, or she's trying to go to court. So those are just, I think, important distinctions. Of course, I would say many, if not most, violence against women organizations around the world are doing both. And Mauro is a perfect example of that, as is Jean, who will join us later. That we're serving victims. We're also understanding through that direct contact that we have with victims every day what those systemic change reforms, the changes and the reforms that are needed. So why don't we move forward with the next slide? international standards have now been developed over the past decades, I would say 10, 20 years, to embrace the need for the integration of systemic and legal change into our work to end violence against women. So it's really grounded. I think it's important to point out in the institutions of the United Nations and the regional institutions, Council of Europe that Mauro works with. The African Union, in fact, has just adopted a new convention on violence against women that has new and more detailed standards for that those requirements for governments who ratify those treaties. So that's been a real embracing that's happened over the last 10, 20 years that I have seen. I've had the privilege to work in this field since 1992. So I've seen this evolution of, the first time that violence against women and women's human rights were acknowledged at the Beijing. We're celebrating that this year at the CSW, the 30-year anniversary of the Beijing Conference and Declaration and Platform for Action. And really those first years when the United Nations acknowledged that women's rights are human rights, violence against women is a human rights violation, and that governments have the obligation to not only provide direct services to victims, either through NGOs or through funding NGOs, but also work on their systems so that they are intervening in this violence to prioritize victim safety and offender accountability for all victims, not just one. We can go on to the next slide. The UN definition of a coordinated community response, I think, is helpful to just acknowledge here also. Systemic change, as I will follow up on in the next slides, is really best achieved through coordination of all stakeholders that have a role to play in the ending of violence against women, whether women and girls, whether it's police responding to a direct call, whether it's prosecutors taking the information they get from police and making sure that offenders are held accountable, whether it's folks like Mauro and Jean who are directly serving those victims. Those institutions, those people have to be coordinated and collaborating if we are going to be successful in our communities in intervening in violence against women. No one institution can do it, can achieve the goals we are all interested in, ending violence against women, alone. Mauro, as I said before, Mauro and her institution cannot solve this problem by sheltering victims. We cannot solve this problem ourselves. In the civil society alone, we have to be working with our government officials. They are the ones that have the powers to pass laws, to make arrests, to institute behavior change programs for violent offenders and require them to come to them. So all of those agencies are needed to be effective in ending violence against women and girls. We can go on to the next slide there. And I just want to say a few words about the Duluth model of coordinated community response, a powerful effort that was started in a community about 2 hours north of where Global Rights for Women is based. We're in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Duluth model of coordinated community response was founded and inspired by Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar way back in the late 70s, early 80s, an interagency effort to change the climate of tolerance in our communities, our institutions against women and girls by practices and procedures which centralize victim safety and offender accountability. So this was where the seed was planted for this coordinated community response idea as a forum and context for systemic change. This model of coordinated community response has been replicated around the world in many different ways. The seed was planted in Duluth, but since that time, and I have had the privilege of seeing this, I've traveled to over 70 countries in my career to share kind of the basic concepts of this coordinated community response. We're often asked to do trainings on it, but each community that well, I should say, reflects this model, does it in their own way, in a way that resonates and is practical for their own community in view of the geopolitical dynamics, the social dynamics, the reality of women in that community, whether there's a law in place or not, for example, maybe there is one, maybe they need changes to it. So it's again, I like to think of it as a seed that was planted years ago, many decades ago, back in Minnesota, and then just really blossoming all over the world. And we can go to the next slide. At the very heart of the Duluth model of coordinated community response, and make sure we credit there the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project, is the power and control wheel, which I think many advocates for addressing not only domestic violence, but many forms of violence against women and girls are familiar with this original power and control wheel. When Global Rights for Women trains around the world, it resonates with everybody. It's a pictorial depiction of what victims' experience is. It's been translated into dozens of languages. And I just have to say, it resonates with victims and advocates who are on the front lines and victims who've experienced this violence in messaging what is the reality that survivors are living with when they're experiencing domestic violence. That power and control that is maintained by all these different tactics you see here in the wheel: coercion, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation. And it may not be physical violence every day, but it's often punctuated by physical violence to reinforce that power and control. So it's critical that this experience and expanding this experience for the different contexts of communities around the world is at the core of the understanding that the multidisciplinary groups that are all involved in the coordinated community response understand this reality for victims. And that's what we mean when we talk about a survivor-centered approach to systemic change. It's understanding those dynamics of domestic violence, or there's actually been a wheel created for sexual violence. Welcome, Jean. I'm so happy to see you here. Oops, she went away, but there's also I think there's a power and control wheel that's been adapted for sex trafficking, and Jean may know more about that, but different forms of violence can be depicted in this kind of image. And the essential understanding is that power and control as the driving force for that violence. And that is most of the violence that women experience is an effort to keep control and power over them, whatever the form of that violence may be. Okay, we've got Jean, so I'm going to keep moving along here quickly. In Duluth, the coordinated community response was originally focused on the criminal justice system. And these are just some of the agencies that are involved in the coordination. So I will say Duluth and many communities around the world focus on not only the systemic change, but also when they're meeting on a regular basis, this interagency councils, these are the folks at the table. And there may be other folks at the table. Many communities, for example, really need to incorporate forensic physicians because they have such power over access to justice in many communities around the world, not so much in the United States. But these are some of the programs that can be involved in a coordinated community response when you're addressing the criminal justice response. And these teams in Duluth, it's called the DIVERT team. They meet about individual cases So they find out, what the knowledge is shared with every effort and understanding with the confidentiality of the victims, but knowledge is shared about, does he have previous convictions? Has he violated orders for protection? What about the children? Are they being used to manipulate the systems, whether it's child welfare? So that information is shared and coordinated to ensure that our responses, not only in individual cases, but then reflecting in systemic strategies, that they're victim-centered, they're focused on safety of the victim, who are mostly women, their children, and they're holding offenders accountable. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide there. This is just really a repetition of what I've already said, but we do use this coordinated community response model to discover problems in a systems response to domestic violence in this specific instance I mentioned here, organize the agencies to solve those problems. And then, of course, so importantly, whatever changes are made need to be monitored to ensure that they are meeting those goals of victim safety and offender accountability. I am going to stop there, and I'm very much going to look forward to your questions in the chat. And we're going to go on to Jean, Enrique, and we've already introduced you, Jean. I hope you're connected, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. I know you're rushing around the CSW in New York today, and we're really, really honored to have you with us, Jean. Thank you. So we'll let you go ahead and do your presentation, and then Maro will do her presentation after that. We'll ask a few questions if we have time, as we did on Monday in our in-person event, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Take it away, Jean.
Thank you so much. Cheryl, am I clear?
You are clear.
Oh,
Perfect.
great, because
We can see your PowerPoint. We can see you.
okay, great. Because I'm in the UN headquarters. I have just finished another panel. It
Nice.
might be better if I turn off my camera while I'm showing the PowerPoint, or you are showing the PowerPoint, because I keep going closer to the microphone just to make sure that I'm very clear. And
Yeah,
then my face will become big as well. So let me turn off my video.
that's just fine, however you want to do it. And I'll turn off mine too. They don't need to see me.
Thank you so much. So I am going to follow the flow of Cheryl, talking about the coordination of systemic change for survivors of GBV. But in particular, I'll be talking about our work on trafficking and how we do the CCR. May I ask for the next slide, please? So I will be introducing in the first few slides our coalition. So the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women Asia Pacific has a vision of a world that is free from sexual exploitation, where there is gender equality. We envision a world where women and children can claim their dignity and integrity, exercise their rights as human beings, and work with others towards their empowerment. Next slide, please. Our mission is to campaign and build international, regional, and national partnerships to change policies and programs of states, transform public consciousness, and empower women and communities towards the eradication of sexual exploitation and all forms of violence against women, and towards a deep change in their quality of life. Our goals, first, would be the support to the empowerment of abused women and children, and advocate for alternatives together with them. So we are a survivor-centered coalition. I myself am a survivor of domestic violence and sexual violence. So the advocates, together with the survivors, we advocate for fundamental social changes done alongside calls to immediate solutions such as comprehensive services for survivors. When we say advocate for fundamental social changes, we are seeking to address structures, intersecting structures of patriarchy, class inequality, and racism and others that aggravate or in which is entrenched gender-based violence, especially sexual violence. Next slide, please. So within this goal, what we were doing in empowering survivors, we transferred online during the pandemic, and we continue to strengthen this to be able to reach more survivors online. And so we came out with this call to survivors who need help if they have experienced violence through information and communication technology. So this effort is led by survivors, and we have peer support groups that conducts healing conversations, before that psychological first aid, and holistic services that include referral and accompaniment to the relevant agencies that could respond to the specific needs of the survivors. Next slide, please. Our second goal is to research and conduct education to deepen public consciousness on GBV and sexual exploitation, as well as understanding the root causes and impacts of trafficking and all forms of sexual exploitation. In the photo, you can see that we are also working with Muslim leaders so that we can address harmful cultural norms, including child marriage, that could also be a form of sexual exploitation. So we were able to form consensus that child marriage, early marriage, or forced marriage are unacceptable. So we are able to do that by together gathering evidences of the harms of GBV, particularly child marriage. Next slide, please. We also educate young men on gender issues, sexuality, and prostitution. And this has been replicated in other countries in Asia so that we reduce the demand side to trafficking, and we reduce the number of perpetrators and revisit the socialization of young men that lead them to perpetrate gender-based violence. Next slide, please. We also reduce the vulnerability of young women through youth camps, and together the youth form the Youth and Students Advancing Gender Equality. Next slide, please. Our third goal is to campaign for systemic changes that will address the causes and effects of trafficking and sexual exploitation. I mentioned the intersectional structural inequalities, but also we work when we say systemic change within institutions. So we work with the village officials to be able to prevent and address trafficking at the village level. So what you can see here is that we sign memoranda of understanding with village officials, both Christian and Muslim, for example, here in the photo in Muslim Mindanao. And we conduct education activities at the community level among community leaders. Next slide, please. So one of our models of coordinated response is our interagency trafficker watch mechanism in one of the cities of Muslim Mindanao. So the trafficker watch was an interagency mechanism, as I mentioned, involving both Muslim and Christian communities to address the problem of Zamboanga as trafficking transit to Malaysia. We coordinated with city level frontliners, meaning the social workers who attend to cases, police, prosecutors, medical, health office of the city in analyzing the problem and developing solutions, as well as building their capacities towards addressing trafficking. We continued down to the barangay or village level champions by signing what I showed earlier as memoranda of understanding. And then we followed that with community education so that we build consensus in the communities that trafficking is unacceptable. We included people's organizations, school teachers, and others who are often receiving reports from the children or the young people of cases of trafficking. So this resulted in the first conviction of a trafficking case in Zamboanga after many years of having passed the law. So the implementation of the law often is weak, but with coordinated response, we were able to make the law work. And also it resulted in comprehensive victim support and the institutionalization of interagency cooperation. So this became the start of the local committees against trafficking and all forms of violence against women and children. The next model, next slide, please, would be the gender-based violence watch groups that we set up in post-disaster areas. Next slide, please. The ones that you saw in the photo were actually the displaced women themselves, whom we trained to be the watch group members with whom we also identify problems and solutions to GBV in their communities. We always have memorandum of understanding and trainings with city level to barangay level officials to ensure their understanding of trafficking and to ensure centering victim support and offender accountability in our community response. So we also conducted continued community empowerment through education on the social construction of gender-based violence, women's rights laws, and survivor-centered response. This has resulted in the prosecution of domestic violence abusers. There was a quantifiable, observable decrease in the incidence of gender-based violence as specified by the GBV watch groups members themselves, and the much-needed community support for the survivors, thereby reducing stigma and also empowering the survivors to make decisions, especially in relation to domestic violence, wherein they find it hard to leave situations of violence. Next slide, please. So I only have 4 models to rush my presentation, just so you know. So the third model, I just want to present how we also conduct community coordinated response with the city of Vigan. In the photo would be the local legislator of the city and their social worker. This is to ensure the functionality of other gender-based violence mechanisms in post-earthquake areas. Next slide, please. So the ultimate outcomes of this coordinated response were the passage of city ordinances that included the institutionalization of a search for the most functional barangay violence against women desk. This incentivizes the officers or the focal persons of the violence against women desks at the village level to be compliant to the survivor-centered standards of responding to cases. So we believe that it's important not only to make them accountable, but also to incentivize them to be able to do their jobs in responding to all cases of GBV, not only trafficking, in a manner that's rights-based, gender responsive, and trauma-informed. And towards that, I already skipped the process because it is similar to the other models that we train them on these skills. Another ordinance would be strengthening the preventive and response program of the city in handling GBV, establishment of a crisis center. And the third one is on how to involve men to oppose violence against women. At the village level, they also passed ordinances to strengthen their violence against women desks because reporting is most crucial for victim survivors to be assisted and so that their situation would not be aggravated. Next slide, please. So the last model would be ensuring functionality of GBV mechanisms in post-typhoon in Tagkawayan, Quezon. So in the photo is the mayor himself, next slide please, and the social welfare officer. So it's very crucial that we are able to get the commitment of the principals, quote unquote, of the municipalities or localities to ensure that the community coordinated response has the necessary support of the local government. Next slide, please. The key accomplishments here were the passage again of ordinances in strengthening the local committees against trafficking and violence against women and children, which is basically the mechanism for coordinated response. In these local committees, the membership are the social welfare office, the local police, local prosecutor, local health office, and others that could be related to gender-based violence and trafficking. So there was also an ordinance that they were able to pass to implement and enforce the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act in their city. It basically enhances mechanisms to ensure the proper implementation of the law. For one village, they were able to pass also the Barangay Violence or Village Violence Against Women and Their Children Act, which was also crucial in supporting the violence against women desk officers with additional operational allowances or financial support by the local government. Next slide, please. So we were able to establish at least 2 GBV watch groups in the first, in the Model 3, with the same number of members that was established in another municipality. Therefore, we reach our target. And 3 in the province of, or in the municipality of Quezon. And we also we went over our target. And so the entire municipality has a zero gender-based violence dream. That's the translation of the Filipino words here. That's the dream of the municipality of Tagkawayan, Quezon. Next slide, please. So they were posting those in their social media pages that also proves their commitment to their vision. So these are the other outcomes, how much women we were able to reach in terms of community eco sessions in both Vigan, Ilocos Norte, and Tagkawayan, Quezon. Next slide, please. So we were able to train the women themselves who were affected or displaced by disasters to be the GBV Watch Group leaders, and they are doing the education that we used to do. So when we do leave the areas, we are confident that they'll be able to continue the community coordinated response. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jean. Oops, there we go. Thank you so much, Jean. Mauro, why don't we go right to you? Before we start, I just want to say one quick thing. Again, so interesting how the Philippines, you know, has suffered the natural disasters and the climate disasters in a way, you know, like I was talking about before. Certainly in, for example, Minnesota, we don't have that kind of suffering going on through these natural disasters, and have figured out a way to be using this coordination, as Jean described, in a different way to respond to the needs of gender-based violence victims in these climate disasters. So just an example of what I was talking about before. Mauro, please go ahead.
Right. Okay, very good. Thank you, everybody, for being here very patiently. And I'm going to start with a bit of a photo presentation to give you an impression of the background, how we started in 2010, what was the situation, and where we are now. This has to do with advocacy, with building institutional change in Armenia. So I will take you step by step. Next slide, please. So in 2010, when we started to work at the Women's Support Center, this was the picture of the government. The clergy and the government were all men, very insensitive and unaware of women's rights. Next. It was, we were really victims of gender stereotypes, and that transformed itself in the popular culture as well. For example, you see school textbooks depicting the mother and the daughter cleaning the house. or soap operas that were depicting women as beaten, suicidal, cheating on their husbands, or just very negative portrayal of women. Next. Or in the ads were all reinforcing the women as a sex object, and really nothing to do with empowerment or intellect or anything else. Next. And then our politicians also, they were considering us only for our beauty, only for being able to give birth to Armenian soldiers, and not at all interested in our intellect, on our capabilities, and on our rights. Next. And then in 2010, we had the first case known in Armenia. I have to say that Armenia was ex-Soviet Republic, and during communism, no social ills, in other words, no problems of society were mentioned in the press. For example, it was unknown and unheard of domestic violence, rape, child abuse, people with disabilities, even you would not see them in the street even. And all this LGBT was criminalized. It was a very difficult time, and society was not prepared. Once in 1991, when we had independence, all these problems came to the surface, and people were not prepared to, first of all, they did not understand it. They did not know how to deal with it. And also, we didn't have prepared service providers, professionals, not psychologists or social workers. They knew how to deal with this. Not to mention that the legislation had nothing in it to protect women and abused children. Next. So what we did was, at the beginning, we started, there was no political will to change. There was a very autocratic government. And the only place we could make our voices heard was in the street. And that's where we started to protest, to have activism, actions taking place. And more our voices were being heard. Next slide. And you see here, young women were really at the forefront. Next. And here we have a banner. This was a March 8th event where they say nothing justifies violence. Next. So 1 in 4 women, the statistics show in Armenia, that are suffering abuse. 60% are domestic abuse. And we had a survey indicating that 76% of the population of those surveyed, which is representative of the population, justified domestic violence. So this is very important, because when you have a society like that, it is very hard to make change. But meantime, we will receive over 5,000 hotline calls of reporting abuse. Next. So now this is up to 2017-18. This was the situation, and in 2017, at the request also in bilateral relations of the European Union, they asked that they adopt a domestic violence law. We have been trying for years and years to pass a domestic violence law, but the government was not willing to do so. But since the European Union came into action in Armenia, they asked for, and I have to say that because also of our activism, because if our voices were not heard, nobody would talk about domestic violence. So this is one very important factor or indicator on how to do change in a society is through activism. And when the domestic violence law was about to be adopted, or ratified, we had a lot of hate speech against the law, and we were accused of destroying traditional values, that we're breaking up families, that we should not interfere about the education of the children, and that finally we are agents of evil. So next. So we had to do a lot of public awareness, and that we participated in interviews on TV, articles in the media. We're very, very vocal about it, participated in conferences, meetings, and here on the right, you see me at the parliament where we were discussing the adoption of the domestic violence law. And there was resistance from parliamentarians saying that, well, if you refuse ice cream to a child, is that considered abuse? If you forbid a child to go out of the house because they have to do their homework, was that considered abuse? So these are some of the level of how they would understand domestic violence. And it was very difficult to convince people, but we pursued, we continue to insist and explain at every step what are we talking about. And very, very important was to bring evidence-based data from working with the victims of domestic violence. And also very important it was to have survivors speak from their experiences. Next, please. So some of the accomplishments that we had in 2013, the government created a special division of the police to deal with cases of domestic violence. And I have to say that when we started training those policemen, it was very difficult, because I remember, session after session, they would resist. They would not want to accept what we were saying. And they were saying that a lot of the times the women are the ones that provoke the men. And therefore, poor man, what he can do, but then in 2017, the law was adopted, as I mentioned. It was not a perfect law. And but we said that it's a stepping stone. And this is very, very important when you do institutional change. Don't expect to have everything at 100%. There will always be time for change, for improvement. Take what you can get, basically. In 2019, also, the government also wanted to create support centers in the region, and we were asked to train those NGOs. That later the government started to subsidize those NGOs, partially subsidize them, and also the only 2 shelters that we have for domestic violence victims. Vouchers were given to the victims in need, and the government now is doing a pilot program for economic empowerment of the victims. And they are creating a national database for domestic violence cases where they input information from support centers, police, prosecutors. So they all have, the data is collected that way. 2 years ago, we made a proposal for amendments to the criminal law and domestic violence law that was finally accepted last year. And we developed manuals for social workers and police together with the Council of Europe. Now, I want to mention, and this is the end of my slides, but I want to mention that there are many experts, so-called experts, that work in various agencies and various offices. But unless you work with the survivors, and in that that you have the practice really that dictates what is needed to change. And policemen also, when they started to work with victims of domestic violence, that was really the major training for them. And I have to say that by the time, you know, in the matter of 2-3 years, I would say that most of the policemen understood and they were very cooperative to work with us. And the reason we were able to work with the police so well, because they understood that we, the support centers, are helping them. Because otherwise, what would they have done with the victims, other than record the abuse? We can take off the, yeah, thank you. How do we do systemic change? First of all, you have to provide, as I mentioned, evidence-based data, and also make sure that you have partners that in the government that you can work with. And we're not a large country. We're only 3 million people, and we don't have that big support in society that you would see in the Philippines that Jean mentioned. At the grassroots is very limited in terms of activism, but we understood that voices are very important in order to create change. So therefore, creating coalitions or network of support centers, and they all becoming vocal. And I have to say that not all support centers, they know how to advocate and they know how to do institutional change. But we work together, and we all are on the same page in order to advocate for change. Institutional change is very difficult. It requires patience, it requires persistence, and it requires for us to speak up every time we have the opportunity. You have to be very sensitive because government officials and ministries, they don't like to be criticized. So you have to present them in a way that, okay, a lot of change, a lot of positive things are happening, but we need to also change here, here, and here. And again, survivors speaking on their experiences, monitoring courts, monitoring police. And in this respect, I'm very thankful to Cheryl, because we work together on Cheryl prepared for us with Vayuna, the Global Rights for Women, document on police response, understanding the laws of the country, and also seeing the gaps through focus groups that they have done in the country. And this document is a very important tool for us to present to the government for them to make changes in what is needed. I want to also say that coordination was a very foreign concept in Armenia. To give you an example, even department, there is in the Ministry of Social Affairs, there is a department for children and the departments for women and family. And between them, the departments would not coordinate. The concept, the concept of coordination, or the idea for it's a foreign concept in Armenia, and we had to explain to them the need for coordination. And when coordination, the community coordination started, it really started out of necessity, where in the regions, for example, one of our colleagues, they had a very difficult case, and they are the ones that created this round table, basically bringing the police, the state social worker, the family, the child protection agency, bring them all together, the school representative, to advocate and to understand the needs of that survivor in order to do better support and coordinated support. Now, from this local level of support, now we are trying to expand to do it at institutional level. In other words, understanding based on this individual coordinating community response, where are the gaps? Where do we find problems in the system that is not working? And we put together a document and we do meetings with the government people to make them understand that this is not working, this needs improvement, or this needs change. I will stop here. I see that there are some questions. If we have many police officers, yes, there is an effort to include more women in the force. However, many women do not want to work in this area. Even as NGOs, we found difficulties finding psychologists or social workers wanting to work because, as you know, it's a very difficult, very draining, very demanding work. Sometimes we are on call because victims are referred to the shelter overnight primarily. And then it's the burnout in this field is tremendous. So yeah, I don't see any more questions, but
Thank you, Mauro. Yeah, there are a couple, and I know that Pat and Olivia will be looking at those. And Jean, if we could have you turn your camera back on, it'd be wonderful to have a discussion here, and I can prompt that a little bit. And then we can wait for others to put questions in the chat. Maybe we'll do it that way. But I have heard you, directed to you, Mauro, first, the partnership that you've developed with the police, I think, has been just particularly inspiring to me in view of the challenge that you faced. I mean, in 2017, the law that was passed, as you say, it was a law preventing domestic violence, but it really wasn't adequate, and you did the work to do the amendments. And what would you say, just talk a little bit more about, and Jean, think about this. Oh, speak up. Okay, I'm not being heard very well. I'm gonna put my,
no, I think it's okay.
is it okay? Okay, I'll speak a
For
little
me,
bit.
it's hard, but I can hear Mauro very well, but I cannot hear Cheryl so well.
Okay, I'll speak up a little bit. Is that better, Jean?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just thinking about the focus groups that you did with survivors and the way you both, and we just really center this also in making that violence visible to the police, and in particular, and Jean, if this question isn't irrelevant to your work, but I know that in doing that listening to survivors of violence, it inspires such change for systemic stakeholders. Could you talk a little bit more about how that worked, Mauro? When you went from 2017 to 2024, I mean, that is 5 years to achieve this really unbelievable change and start to lay the groundwork for coordinated community response with your partnership with the police. If you would just talk a little bit more about
that. Sure. I have to say that it's very important that there is political will in the country. In other words, even though they don't know how to change or what to do to change, there is still a political will to listen to civil society and to listen to the needs. Also, very, very important is the pressure that is put on the police, basically through the media, where we point out, the failure in responding, or we point out the fact that not enough protection was offered, and bring out more and more cases so that subject does not remain taboo. It has to be public. It has to be out there in order for people to react and respond. Now, working with the police, so the police also responds very well when they see that this is not taboo, this is not a silent problem. So then, therefore, they're forced to react. Now, in working with them, we also are very sensitive to their needs. Sometimes I'm told, don't mention constantly when I do the trainings, don't mention women victim, because the majority of the policemen are men, and therefore they feel very much targeted in a way as men. So we also talk about we change persons victim of domestic violence. We make it so they can feel more comfortable with this. I mean, you have to take into consideration their sensitivities too. You cannot just be ignorant of that if you want to make some change. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, Cheryl, the survivors, that's what I'm saying about working with the victims is what teaches us. That and the way Duluth created the power and control wheel, that was not an invention. That was from hundreds and thousands of women interviewed, and when I present the power and control wheel in my trainings, I tell them that this is not an invention. This is what women have experienced, and there are patterns. And when I explain to them about trauma, that's also something that is completely not found in any of the literature in Armenia. And police are really, then they understand based on examples. When I give them real examples of survivors, when survivors themselves speak out, that's when it registers with them very much. We cannot hear you. You're on mute.
Oh, you take it from the abstract
Yeah.
to the again, making the violence visible. This is a real person. This is a real victim. And with that that picture that you get of the reality of what women, mostly women, are the victims of domestic violence and trafficking. There is an understanding, I think, with stakeholders, government stakeholders, that just you can't achieve without that. Jean, I see you nodding. You want to jump in here too? I know you did focus groups when we were working together you did them before, but when we were working together with our project in the Philippines. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Thank you, Cheryl. May I request Vayuna or Pat to share my PowerPoint? I just have a couple slides on that. But I also am noting that there are 2 questions in the Q&A. And I also noted the question about do ordinances work? So while I'm waiting for the PowerPoint, just so I can show the focus group discussions, I would want to quickly say that the local ordinances at the village level are very, very important because we often lament the lack of implementation of national laws. But if there are local ordinances, they follow up and also enhance the practical application of the laws that could be also tailor-fit for the needs of that particular community, so that exhibit also the political will of the community that they will be implementing the law, and it creates also consensus in terms of how the community are approaching that form of violence against women. So about the focus group discussion, our goal was to advocate for survivors' participation in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of the recovery and reintegration program for trafficked persons. This is in the Philippines, and this is being operationalized by the Department of Social Welfare and Development. Next slide, please. So you can see that we had to do our focus group discussions online. And these are survivors and they have come out, so I can show their faces to you. Next slide, please. But what's really important is for us to appreciate what were identified during the focus group discussions. It validated the need for integration of the best practices that I presented to you earlier, that the survivors themselves are supporting their fellow survivors. So peer organizing of support system has been crucial to their healing. And therefore, support systems have to be built among survivor groups. We have proven that to be most effective in the healing process of the survivors. That's the reason why we also form GBV watch groups at the community level, because if they have this strong support group, they build their confidence and they know that they have other women that's backing them up. Also, the other theme that was identified was the need for long-term intervention and also the re-examination of the financial assistance by the government. Long-term intervention, because sometimes social workers were trained to only respond to the practical needs of the survivors. But when survivors have experienced childhood sexual abuse, they really need long-term intervention for trauma healing, and any form of financial assistance won't go anywhere if they have not felt that they are healing. And in terms of the financial assistance itself, usually what's being provided by the government, and that's part of the RRPTP, is only 10,000. It's like I think I made a translation to peso. It's a few, I think $200. And that's it. And that won't bring them anywhere, but they will just use it to pay for their debts. That's why it's very important that survivors are part of the formulation of recovery and reintegration programs. The next, I wonder if there's a next slide related to FGD. So these were our findings. There you go, $192. So it's a measly livelihood assistance, would only be enough to pay off incurred debts and will not go a long way into their recovery. The short-term assistance also by social workers do not address the trauma by survivors, especially since our studies show that 90% of those sexually trafficked were also sexually abused as girl children. As I've mentioned, any economic assistance will hardly be meaningful when the women have not undergone trauma-informed healing, as they could not reach the resolve to recover. Holistic response would not be achieved if survivors are not central and not participating in formulating the program. So those are the findings from the FGD. Thank you, Cheryl, for the question.
Oh, thank you so much, Jean. I just would follow up by saying, as advocates, we can talk about these things. We probably know them. But when we are intentionally doing the focus groups and listening to the survivors and taking the notes of the voices of the survivors themselves and bringing that to our institutions and stakeholders, that has a power that we don't. I mean, the direct experience from the voices of the survivors themselves just increases, I think, that strength of the message. And of course, if you can't, you really have to be careful, of course, about consultations with survivors, because they, we all know they can be re-traumatized by these questions. So we actually have a manual. Both Mauro and Jean know about our manual that we did with the United Nations, UN Women. Thanks to UN Women for that support. On safe consultations with survivors, so that you ensure that you're getting those stories. Maybe Pat or Olivia could put that manual, the link to that manual in the chat. It's on our website. And Mauro, I see you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I saw some questions right now, so I want to address them.
Yes, please do.
Yes, there was a case in 2010, as I mentioned, that opened the floodgates, as they say, because no other time was domestic violence mentioned in the media. So you take advantage of those situations when something, terrible comes out in the media, because that's what galvanizes and brings people interest into the situation, and that's when you can educate even more. Another public education question: the more you speak about the topic, the more you explain, the more you present, the more survivors you have to choose. Your survivors, the ones that are willing to speak, and the ones that they can express themselves properly, because not everybody is able to express themselves. So that's very important also as a public education. We do not have national awareness campaign in Armenia, which those can be also very, very helpful. We advocate for that, because a good ad, a good informative campaign is also on television and all that. It's very, very important as well. And then prevention. There was a question on prevention on violence against women. You know, when I remember when we started in 2010, the government people, the ministry people were asking us, okay, so what is prevention? How do you do prevention? You know, prevention is not just a switch on and off. Prevention is a series of steps that you have to take. First of all, you have to have good legislation. And then you have to have services for women. I remember there was a region in Armenia that never referred to us any case. And they were telling us it's because the population is not very dense there. But the moment we put a support center in that region, the cases started coming. So, and that's prevention, because you help women not to be abused and not to eventually maybe be murdered. So it's important. So services is another factor. And the third thing for prevention is awareness in the communities that healthy relationship versus abusive relationship be taught in schools. That right now it's happening in Armenia. And because we know that domestic violence, it's a learned behavior, and many boys become abusers in their adult life if they have experienced that in their childhood, in their families, if they've seen that. So education is a very important also element of prevention. So I'd like to stop here.
Yeah, hugely, hugely important. And I see we have a question in the chat, and we'll get to that. Both Jean and Mauro, if you can, although it's in the Q&A, if you could both read that, and I will too. And I just want to say, follow up on something Mauro said. We have, you know, for all of the decades of work that Minnesota has done on just all forms of violence, particularly a leader in domestic violence, we also have, you know, setbacks and backlash. And right now, there is an effort by, we published along with the internal Minneapolis working group on domestic violence, an internal group of stakeholders. We published a report on the police response to domestic violence. And we found just really, really tragic gaps that were leading to just continued abuse and not holding offenders accountable. And I think soon after that report was published by the working group in Global Rights for Women, there was a death in our community, a tragic, tragic death of a Native woman. Disproportionately, Native women are murdered and abused, as opposed to our dominant white population. And it's the aunt of this victim is taking that story of the police failing to respond to that, the repeated calls from this young woman to help her, and repeated abuse, and making that violence visible. And you know, I hate to say using that death, but it's so important to get that story out, to mobilize our stakeholders as to the importance of making change. And I'm grateful to the internal working group that's working on these changes. And it all just takes taking this story and making it a catalyst for change in protecting women. So we have, I'm rambling on here a bit, but I wanted to lift up that story a little bit.
Michelle, this question from our listeners from Canada about amendment to their criminal law. And
yes, the coercive control. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. You know, I don't understand why they think that it's traumatizing. You know, in any international publication, you will find out, you will see that accountability, making the perpetrator accountable for his actions, is the healing process for the victim, for the survivor. So without accountability, she will not have had any healing. Yes, when the woman goes to court and she has to explain there what happened, yes, it's traumatizing. But it is more traumatizing when the perpetrator is not made accountable for his actions. And this is not a one-time action. Domestic violence, we know that it's a long time in effect. In other words, it's a continuous, repetitive abuse. So it's even much more punishable because it's been done for so many years, for so many times. So I think that you should, and I see that one person here mentions the Judith Herman book on trauma recovery, truth and repair, which explains exactly this thing, this aspect, that not making the perpetrator accountable is very traumatizing for the survivors. So you have to advocate more in those terms. And you have to bring out documentation indicating that making the perpetrator accountable is absolutely necessary in criminalization of the acts.
Yeah, and we can accountability can mean a lot of things, and it means different things to different victims. And I do think we have to acknowledge, the intervention of the criminal justice system, certainly in the United States, has been for marginalized groups, people of color, certainly the Native community. Our accountability measures are oftentimes also re-traumatizing in the way that we do them. So I really appreciate Judith Herman. We all recommend that incredible insight that she provides us over and over again, and recommend that.
So Canada, don't follow United States.
Yeah, I believe every country, we have this wonderful history of decades of progress. We also have profound problems. And certainly we do now. I'm going to say that with the promotion of women's equality and human rights and ending violence against women. It's just a profound problem, and we all experience this in our countries. This progress, backlash, and all of us, all of we women's human rights leaders, are just so critical to the movement in going forward. How are we doing on time here? Did you have something you wanted to mention, Jean, about the question about coercive control? I'm happy to describe it a little bit more if for those who aren't familiar with this concept of criminalizing coercive controlling behavior, or would you like to say something, Jean?
I agree with Maro. Perhaps I did not hear everything that Cheryl said, but I have an impression that this debate is dominant in North America, because elsewhere the sentiment is how Maro would have articulated it. I also want to just bring some attention to the other questions. I hope that we are able to address the concerns of those who came about, I don't know, Maro, if you address the case of Armenia that catalyzed your movement to prevent domestic violence. I think that's part of your presentation. I also answered already the question on approaches to public education for eliminating vow. This might be relevant to others. So we start with the human rights session. It's important to emphasize that women's rights are human rights. And then we have to discuss gender sensitivity so that we are also able to detail where these are coming from gender stereotypes, etc., patriarchal norms. Before going through the power and control that Cheryl presented, it's very important to demystify the myths. Then we have to talk about the standards on how to look at the different forms of violence against women. So the international consensus, and for us, it's important for us as survivors, as Maro also said, to be heard. No? I'm also speaking as a survivor, and often we would be facilitating so that they hear our voices, what was really happening, how we felt, and what's really important for us to be able to recover from this situation. So just to answer those questions, I was quite brief about the criminal code because I think Maro already answered that. Thank you,
Okay.
Cheryl.
Thank you, Jean. Regarding boys and men who are victims of violence, indeed, I have to say that, as you know, the vast majority, over 94–95%, are women victims of violence. Nevertheless, we encounter cases of men who are victim of abuse. In general, it's more emotional, psychological abuse or economic abuse with men. But in the gay community, you find a lot of abuse. It's possible to be their abuse also. However, especially in patriarchal society, men do not come out. They don't report this to the police. They don't, because they are very much labeled and stigmatized and laughed upon many times, and they know that they will not be able to receive support. So sometimes they come to the support centers, but even there, you know, the centers are called women's support centers. So many times men do not identify with those centers. So unfortunately, men can tend to be neglected. There are LGBTQ centers, and they can go there. But then again, as in cases in Armenia, the police are really not very efficient in addressing their needs. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
I also want
Go
to
ahead,
add,
Lucy.
sorry, Cheryl.
No, go ahead.
May I still add?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so we have also developed modules on violence experienced by LGBTQ community. And we have also advocated with the local mechanisms, protection mechanisms, that they should receive all cases. So whoever would be the victims of gender-based violence, then these local protection mechanisms should be available for all of them.
The issue, I think, goes back to power and control. I don't, if you agree, Jean and Mauro, you know, there are women certainly that use power and violence to keep power and control over their intimate partners. It's just not, you know, the dominant, those aren't the dominant numbers. And it's kind of intuitive. I mean, men, they have power, they have physical power, they have more power in society due to just the inequality that is still pervasive. So, you know, it's not surprising that most victims of violence are women and girls. But certainly we acknowledge that. Men are too. Yeah, so we are almost at our hour. I would like to, first of all, I want to thank you, Jean and Mauro, for taking this time with us. It has been such a privilege to work, an honor to work with you both in your countries, first of all. I'm so grateful for your sharing your years and decades of experience and expertise with our audience. This has been recorded so people can access it after this. And do you have any just final comments you'd like to say?
Well, first of all, thank you. And I want to also mention, I forgot to say this, that, you know, in countries where domestic violence is not well institutionalized yet at a very high level, it's very important to have interaction with organizations that have experience. And I remember how from Armenia, there was a delegation of NGOs and government officials that went to Duluth. And for the first time, it opened their eyes. We never heard about community coordinated response. We never heard about risk assessment, for example. And those are, or a one-stop shop service provider. Those are all interactions that help us expand in our knowledge, know-how on how to really provide better services, but also how to better advocate at the institutional level.
Yes, and we welcome visitors to Duluth. I want to acknowledge The Domestic Abuse Intervention Project up there is just so incredibly experienced and welcoming. And I believe Scott Miller is still the ED up there. And we love to bring visitors up there. So all of you out there who might consider that, please get in touch. And Jean, do you have a
Just to thank you, Cheryl, and the Global Rights for Women. I'm also happy to connect with Maro. I recognize that Sanctuary for Families is here, and I'm sure they can also answer questions related to gender-based violence, violence against women and girls, etc. We have a rich resource in the room, but we lack time. So I'm sure the GRW will be able to share our shared contact details. Thank
Yes,
you
and they
so
have been
much.
in the chat. They have been in the chat. So you may be getting some emails. Thank you again, Jean, Mauro. Thank you for all the participants to come. Onward we go. We persist.
Yeah, maybe we can put the emails on the chat.
Yes, they have been. Your contact information has been in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.